Here is something nobody tells you about investing in your child's dream. The moment you sign that check, you stop being their parent. You become their banker, and bankers apparently don't get invited to grand openings. Let me tell you all about my experience. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 63 years old, retired from 31 years in commercial real estate, and I like to think I have seen every variation of human deception this world has to offer. I have sat across negotiating tables from men who smiled while they robbed you. I have shaken hands with people whose grip was warm and whose intentions were frozen solid. I thought after 3 decades of that, nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. And the person who proved me wrong was a 5'6" woman in a cashmere sweater who called me Dad at Thanksgiving and asked for the salt like she was already planning what to do with my money. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stay with me. It started, as most disasters do, with a dream that sounded completely reasonable. My son Preston came to me on a Sunday afternoon in March. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, Patricia beside me drying her hands on a dish towel, and he laid out this business plan like he was presenting to the board of a Fortune 500 company. Craft brewery, Pacific Northwest style, tap room, small batch production, local distribution. He had folders, projections, a logo for heaven's sake. I looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at me. Preston leaned forward and said, "Dad, I've been researching this for 2 years. This isn't a whim. This is a real business." I picked up one of the folders and flipped through it slowly. I said, "Where did you get these projections?" Preston said, "Serena helped me put them together. She has a background in finance. You know that." Not a word. Just a sound. The kind of sound a woman makes when she's being polite but her entire soul is screaming. I had been married to her for 38 years. I spoke that language fluently. I looked at the logo on the front of the folder. It said Ashford & Co. Brewing. I will admit, something moved in my chest when I saw that. My name. My son's ambition. 31 years of work potentially building into something that would outlast me. I said, "How much?" Then I said, "I'll think about it." Now, what I did not tell Preston that afternoon, what I did not tell anyone, was that I had already started thinking about it 3 weeks earlier. Because 3 weeks earlier, Patricia had said something to me that I could not unhear. We had been at Preston and Serena's house for dinner. Serena had made this elaborate lamb dish, candles on the table, the whole performance. And when Preston excused himself to take a phone call, Serena smiled at me across the table and said, "Walter, Preston talks about you constantly. He really wants to make you proud." She tilted her head and said, "This brewery is going to change everything for us, for the whole family." I nodded. I said, "It's a big investment." She held my gaze just a half second too long and said, "You won't regret it." On the drive home, Patricia was quiet for about 10 minutes. Then she said, "She already knows the number." I said, "What number?" Patricia said, "The investment number. Preston hasn't asked you yet, but she already knows what she's asking for." I could see it. The way she was watching you. I did not respond immediately, but I filed it. Right next to the lamb dinner and the candles and the smile that lasted a half second too long. I called Douglas Fitch on a Tuesday morning in April. Douglas and I went to Ohio State together. He is the only man I know who finds tax fraud genuinely entertaining. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Doug, I need a favor." Douglas said, "The last time you said that I spent 4 days auditing a parking garage in Cincinnati. So you'll forgive me if I sigh before I say go ahead." He sighed. Then he said, "Go ahead." I told him about the brewery, about Preston, about Serena, about Patricia's instinct and the half-second smile. Douglas listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he said, "You want me to look at the business plan?" He said, "Everything is a big word, Walter." I said, "I know what I'm paying you for." He laughed. He said, "Give me 2 weeks." I gave Douglas his 2 weeks. And in the meantime, I played my role perfectly. I called Preston and told him I was in. I watched him go quiet on the phone, that particular silence of a man who cannot believe something he wanted is actually happening. He said, "Dad, really?" I said, "It's a good plan, son. I believe in you." What I did not say was, "I believe in you completely. It's someone else I'm not so sure about." Patricia was standing in the doorway when I hung up. She said, "You're not transferring the money yet, are you?" I said, "Of course not." She said, "Good." Then she went back to her book. 38 years, and she still trusted my instincts even when I hadn't fully explained them. That woman deserves a monument. Douglas called me on a Thursday evening. I knew from his tone in the first 2 seconds that he had found something. Douglas is a man who is almost always dry and almost always bored. That evening, he sounded like a man who had just opened a present he did not expect. He said, "Walter, you're going to want to sit down." I said, "I'm already sitting." He said, "Sit better." I pulled my chair closer to the desk. I said, "Talk to me." Douglas said, "That business plan your daughter-in-law put together? Beautiful document. Professional. Clean projections. Solid market research. Reasonable timelines." He paused, completely disconnected from the actual financial structure she filed with the county. The room got very still. I said, "Say that again." Douglas said, "The business plan she gave your son is a showpiece. What she actually registered, the LLC structure, the operational accounts, the vendor contracts, it tells a completely different story. There's a second account, Walter. Operational expenses are being routed through a holding company that has nothing to do with the brewery." I said, "Whose holding company?" Douglas went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Fellow by the name of Richardson Hale." I sat back in my chair. I closed my eyes, and I thought about Serena at that dinner table, candles flickering, lamb on the plate, telling me I wouldn't regret it. I said, "Doug, how long have they been setting this up?" He said, "From what I can tell, before Preston ever walked into your kitchen with those folders." I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. The house was quiet. Patricia was upstairs. The clock on the wall ticked the way it always does. Patient, indifferent, keeping time whether you want it to or not. I thought about my son. I thought about the way his voice cracked slightly when I told him I believed in him. And then I picked up the phone and called Pete Harrington. Pete answered in that slow, deliberate way of his, like every word costs him something and he's decided you're worth it. He said, "Walter, it's been a while." I said, "Pete, I need to set up an escrow account, and I need it done quietly." A pause. Then Pete said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by Monday." I hung up. I looked at the clock. I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because the game had changed, and only one of us knew it yet. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. Let me tell you something about being deliberately excluded. It is not the exclusion itself that hurts. It is the performance that surrounds it, the careful construction of reasons, the cheerful tone of voice, the way people look at you like you are supposed to smile and accept it and ask no questions. I have never been good at that last part. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Patricia came to find me in my study. I was reading, or pretending to. Mostly I was thinking about Douglas's phone call, and the name Richardson Hale, and the way a person could build a trap with folders and projections and a logo with your family name on it. Patricia stood in the doorway and said, "Serena called." I looked up, I said, "And?" She said, "The brewery opened." I put my book down very slowly. I said, "When?" Patricia said, 10 days ago. The room was quiet. I let that number sit in the air between us. 10 days. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a photograph sent casually the way people do when they want to seem like they remembered you as an afterthought. Nothing. I said, "What exactly did she say?" Patricia sat down across from me. She folded her hands in her lap the way she does when she is controlling something. Anger, I suspected, though with Patricia it always comes out looking like composure. She said, and I am quoting directly here, so don't look at me like that. She said, "It was 10 days ago. We only invited close family and friends." It was very intimate, very low-key. I looked at my wife. My wife looked at me. I said, "Close family and friends." Patricia said, "That's what she said." I said, "We are his parents." Patricia said, "I'm aware of that, Walter." I leaned back in my chair. I thought about the word intimate. I thought about $480,000. I thought about how intimate is a very interesting word to use when you were describing an event that was funded almost entirely by someone you chose not to invite. Then I smiled. Patricia watched me smile and said, "Why are you smiling?" I need you to explain the smile because from where I'm sitting, there is nothing remotely amusing about any of this. I said, "I'm smiling because she called." Patricia said, "She called to tell us we weren't invited." I said no. She called to check on me. There's a difference. Patricia stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Pete?" I said, "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." She nodded once, stood up, smoothed her blouse, and walked back out of the room like a woman who had decided to trust her husband one more time and was reserving the right to say "I told you so" if it went sideways. 3 days passed. I went about my life with the particular calmness of a man who is waiting for something he is already prepared for. I had breakfast. I read the paper. I called Douglas twice to confirm the details he had sent me. And both times he answered with the enthusiasm of a man who was genuinely enjoying himself, which for Douglas meant he said things like, "This gets more interesting every day," in the same tone most people use to discuss the weather. On the third day, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Serena. I let it ring twice, not because I wasn't ready, but because I believe in the power of making people wait exactly long enough to feel it. Then I answered. I said, "Serena, what a nice surprise." Her voice came through warm and slightly breathless, the way it always was when she was performing urgency without wanting to seem panicked. She said, "Walter, hi, I'm so glad you picked up. How are you? How's Patricia?" I said, "We're wonderful, just enjoying the week. Quiet around here." She laughed, that light, practiced laugh. She said, "That sounds so nice. Listen, I don't want to take up too much of your time." I said, "You're not. Take all the time you need." A tiny pause. Then she continued, "So we've been getting the brewery fully operational. And you know how it is with new businesses. The first few weeks are there's so much coming at you at once. Vendors, staffing, permits." I said, "Sounds exciting." She said, "It really is. It really truly is. Preston is in his element. It's wonderful to watch." Another small pause, shorter this time. "So the thing is, Walter, some of the initial bills are coming due. Operational setup costs, some equipment balances, just the natural cash flow of a new launch. And we were expecting the investment transfer to have cleared by now, and I just wanted to touch base and make sure everything was still on track on your end." Silence. I let it stretch. 1 second. 2. 3. She said, "Walter." I said, "I'm here." She said, with just the faintest tremor of impatience underneath the warmth, "Did you get a chance to transfer the money?" And I smiled. Not the polite smile I use at dinner parties. Not the professional smile from 30 years of closing deals. The real one. The one Patricia says makes me look like I know something the rest of the room doesn't. I said, "Of course. It was handled weeks ago." Now, you need to understand what happened in the silence that followed that sentence, because that silence told me everything I needed to know and confirmed everything Douglas had already found. If Serena was who she presented herself to be, a devoted wife, a diligent business partner, a daughter-in-law who simply forgot to invite her husband's parents to a grand opening, that silence would have lasted half a second. She would have exhaled and said something like, "Oh, wonderful, it must just be a processing delay. I'll check with our bank." Instead, the silence lasted 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is a long time on a phone call. I counted. Then she said very carefully, "Handled how?" I said, "Transferred. As agreed. Every dollar." She said, "To the account?" I said, "To the account that was set up for this purpose, yes." Another pause, shorter this time, but tighter. I could almost hear her recalculating behind it. She said, "Which account specifically? Because I want to make sure our bookkeeper is looking in the right place." I said, "Pete Harrington has all the details. He handled the transfer on my behalf. You remember Pete. I mentioned him when we discussed the legal structure. Give him a call. He's been expecting to hear from someone." The temperature of the conversation changed. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. Something shifted, the way air shifts before a storm. And for just a moment, just one unguarded moment, Serena stopped performing. She said, "Who is Pete Harrington?" And there it was. Because if you were a legitimate daughter-in-law managing a legitimate business funded by your father-in-law's legitimate investment, and your father-in-law told you his lawyer handled the transfer, you would say, "Great, I'll call him right away. What's his number?" You would not say, "Who is Pete Harrington?" in a voice that had gone 2 degrees colder than it was 60 seconds ago. I said very pleasantly, "He's my attorney. Has been for 20 years. Wonderful man. Slow talker, but thorough. You'll like him." She recovered quickly. "I will give her that," she said. "Of course, yes. I'll reach out to him. Do you have a number for him?" I said, tell him Walter sent you. He'll take good care of you. We said our goodbyes with all the warmth of a business transaction, disguised as a family conversation. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen where Patricia was making coffee, and I said, she called. Patricia said, without turning around, I know. I could tell by your walk. I said, she's going to call Pete within the hour. Patricia poured 2 cups and handed me one. She said, and what is Pete going to tell her? I said exactly what I told him to. Patricia wrapped both hands around her mug and said, and Preston, when does Preston find out? I looked out the kitchen window at the yard. The oak tree we planted the year Preston was born was thick and solid now, roots deep, branches wide. I had watched that tree for 31 years. I said, soon, but not from Serena, and not before we know exactly how deep this goes. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then she said very softly, he's going to be devastated. I said, I know that too. We stood there in the kitchen, coffee warm in our hands, the oak tree standing in the yard, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, that some discoveries cannot be unfound, and some loyalties once tested reveal exactly what they were made of all along. My phone buzzed an hour and 17 minutes later. It was Pete. I answered and said, that was fast. Pete, in his slow and deliberate way, said, she called, asked about the account. I told her the funds had been secured in escrow pending verification of the operational structure. I said, how did she take that? Pete paused in that way of his, like he is choosing each word from a very specific shelf. Then he said, she asked what verification meant. I told her it meant we needed to confirm that the registered business accounts matched the investment agreement. She asked how long that would take. Another pause. I told her it depended entirely on how cooperative the documentation process was. I said, and. Pete said, she hung up before I finished the sentence. I set my coffee down on the counter. I said, Pete, it's time to make the call to Douglas. Pete said, already ahead of you. He sent the filing documents an hour ago. A long pause. Then, slowly, like a man savoring the weight of what he's about to say, Pete added, Walter, there's something else. I said, tell me. I said, what about him? Pete said, he's not just Serena's cousin. He filed paperwork in 2 other counties, 2 other businesses, 2 other investors. The kitchen was very quiet. I said, this isn't the first time. Pete said, no, Walter, it is not. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after that call. The oak tree, the yard. 31 years of watching something grow. And somewhere across town, in a brewery with my family's name above the door, a woman was making phone calls she thought I didn't know about to a man I now knew more about than she realized. The smile came back. The real one. Because the thing about being a banker instead of a parent, sometimes being the banker is exactly the right position to be in. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. There is a particular kind of morning that exists only in the weeks before something enormous happens. The sky looks the same. The coffee tastes the same. The birds outside do whatever birds do, completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere nearby, a carefully constructed lie is about to meet the person who built the trap it walked into. I have always loved those mornings. It was a Friday. Patricia was at the table when I came downstairs. She had her reading glasses on and her coffee in front of her, and she looked up at me the way she has looked up at me for 38 years, like she already knows what I'm about to say and is simply waiting for me to say it. I said, today. She took her glasses off, set them on the table, said Preston too. I said Preston first. She nodded, stood up, refilled her coffee and said with the quiet devastation of a mother who loves her son completely, make sure he hears it from you gently, Walter. Whatever she did, he still loves her. That part is real, even if nothing else was. I looked at my wife and thought, not for the first time, that the smartest decision I ever made in my life was asking her to marry me in a parking lot outside a Denny's in Columbus, Ohio, in 1986, with $17 in my wallet and nothing to offer but my word. I said, I'll be gentle. She said, you're going to want to be, because the moment he finds out, the gentle part becomes your job, and the fury becomes his, and you need him clear-headed for what comes next. I called Preston at 9 a.m. He answered on the first ring, the way young men answer when they're busy and distracted and running on the energy of something new. He said, "Dad, hey. Good timing, actually. We just got the tap system fully calibrated. You should come see it sometime. It's incredible." I said, "Preston, I need you to come over." Something in my voice stopped him. I know this because the background noise of the brewery, the clinking, the movement, the low hum of machinery, all of it went quiet, like he had stepped into a separate room. He said, "Is everything okay? Is Mom?" I said, "Mom is fine. Everyone is fine. But I need you to come over, and I need you to come alone." A pause. Then, carefully, "How alone?" I said, "Don't tell Serena you're coming." The silence that followed was the longest one we had shared since the day I told him his grandfather had passed. I could feel him on the other end of the line, turning that sentence over, looking at it from different angles, not wanting to understand what it might mean. He said, "Dad, what's going on?" I said, "Come over, son. I'll explain everything." He arrived 40 minutes later. He came through the front door and into the kitchen, and he looked exactly like what he was. A 34-year-old man who had driven across town with a knot in his stomach that he didn't have a name for yet. Patricia hugged him first, held on a beat longer than usual. Preston let her, which told me the knot had already started to tighten. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had laid out his folders and his projections and his logo 14 months ago. I sat across from him. Patricia stayed nearby but gave us the room. I did not ease into it. In my experience, easing into devastating news only prolongs the part where the person is confused and shortens the part where they can actually think. So I laid the folder on the table. Douglas's folder. Clean, organized, numbered. I said, before I transferred a single dollar of that investment, I had someone look at everything. Preston looked at the folder. He did not touch it. He said, "What kind of someone?" I said, "Douglas Fitch. You've met him. My college roommate. Forensic accountant." Preston's jaw moved slightly. He said, "You had the business plan audited." I said, "I had everything audited." He looked up at me, and I watched something move across his face. Not anger, not yet. Something more complicated. The particular expression of a person who is starting to understand that two conversations have been happening simultaneously, and they were only present in one of them. He said quietly, "What did he find?" I opened the folder, and I walked him through it. Every page. The shell company. The routing of operational funds through Richardson Hale's holding company. The discrepancy between the business plan Serena had presented to Preston and the actual legal and financial structure she had filed independently. The two other counties. The two other investors. The pattern that was older than their marriage and more deliberate than anything Preston had been willing to consider. I spoke slowly. I did not editorialize. I let the documents do what documents do, which is tell the truth without emotion, which is sometimes the only way truth can be heard. When I finished, Preston sat very still. He did not cry. He did not shout. He stared at the folder for a long moment, and then he said in a voice that was almost too controlled, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough to protect the money, not long enough to protect you from this conversation. I'm sorry about that." He said, "The investment, the 480. I said, "In escrow. Pete Harrington's office. Every dollar, it never went anywhere. Serena could reach it." Something crossed his face then. Relief and grief arriving at the same moment, which is one of the cruelest combinations a person can experience. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Then he said, "She told me you'd transferred it. Weeks ago, she showed me a confirmation." I said, "I know." He said, "She fabricated a transfer confirmation?" I said, "Douglas believes so. Pete is working with that assumption." Preston pushed back from the table slowly, stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and stood there with his back to me, looking at the yard, the oak tree. I let him have that. After a long moment he said, without turning around, "Richardson Hale." I said, "Her cousin." He said, "I've met him. 4 times. He came to the brewery last month to look at the equipment." I thought he was just... He stopped. I watched his shoulders rise and fall. I introduced myself, showed him around. He shook my hand. The room was very quiet. Then Preston said, still at the window, "Was any of it real, Dad? Did she ever..." He stopped again. Started over. Was the brewery real, at least? Or was that just the mechanism? And that was the question I had been dreading, because the answer was complicated in the way that only true things can be complicated. I said, "The brewery is real. The building is leased. The equipment exists. The permits are valid. What wasn't real was where the money was going after it arrived. The plan was to run the brewery long enough to justify the investment, extract as much as possible through the operational accounts, and then, Douglas believes, manufacture a financial collapse. Bankruptcy. Clean exit. Preston turned around. His eyes were dry, but his face looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 40 minutes. He said, "And then what? They just disappear." I said, "There's a property, Pete found it. Coastal. Listed under a holding company that connects back to Richardson Hale." Preston stared at me. He said, "She was going to take my father's money and buy a house." I said, "That appears to be the intention, yes. Like a man whose legs have decided they've had enough." He put his elbows on the table, and his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a while. I did not fill the silence. Some silences are not meant to be filled. Patricia appeared in the doorway. She looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod. She came to the table and sat beside Preston and put her hand on his back and said nothing. Just that. Her hand on his back. After a while, Preston lifted his head. His eyes were red now, but his voice when it came was steadier than I expected. He said, "What happens next?" What happened next took 11 days. Pete filed the documentation with the county. Douglas's report went to 2 investigators who had, it turned out, been building a separate case on Richardson Hale for 18 months, and were very interested in what we had. Serena received a formal notice from Pete's office on a Tuesday morning. I was told she called Pete 4 times that day. Pete, being Pete, returned none of those calls until he was ready. And when he was ready, he spoke slowly and thoroughly, and left no room for misunderstanding. Richardson Hale was arrested on a Thursday. Serena retained a lawyer by Friday afternoon, and on Saturday morning my phone rang. "Serena," I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. She said, "Walter." Her voice was different. The warmth was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was something rawer and, I thought, more honest than anything she had offered me in 2 years of Sunday dinners, and cashmere sweaters and carefully angled smiles. She said, "You knew. From the beginning." I said, "Not from the beginning, but early enough." A long pause. Then she said, "The escrow account." Another pause. "You were never going to just wire the money." I said, "No." She said, "Why didn't you just say something? Confront us." And I thought about that. I thought about Preston at the kitchen window, the oak tree, Patricia's hand on his back. I thought about 2 other investors in 2 other counties, who presumably had not had a Douglas Fitch or a Pete Harrington and had not had a wife who noticed a half-second smile. I said, "Because saying something would have protected my money. What I did protects the people who come after you." Silence. Long and complete. Then she said very quietly, "He didn't know, Walter. Preston didn't know any of it." I said, "I know that." I said, "He's my son. I know exactly what he is." She had nothing after that. We said nothing more. The call ended. Preston filed for divorce 8 weeks later. It was not easy. None of it was easy. He came to dinner on Thursday nights, and sometimes he talked, and sometimes he just sat with us and ate, and let the house be what it had always been, a place where nothing was required of him except to show up. The brewery, as it turned out, was viable, genuinely viable, stripped of the financial architecture Serena had built around it and restructured with Pete's guidance and Douglas's oversight. It had good bones, good location, good product. On a Tuesday in October, on a morning when the sky was doing that particular autumn thing where everything looks cleaner than it has any right to, Preston called me. He said, "Dad, I want to show you something." I drove across town. I parked in front of a building with a sign above the door. The sign said, "Ashford & Co. Brewing." Preston was standing outside waiting for me. He looked like himself again, not the version from the kitchen table, the earlier version, the one with the folders and the projections and the logo. He said, "I know it's not how we planned it. I know a lot happened. But," he stopped, looked up at the sign. "It's still real. It was always going to be real." I stood beside my son on the sidewalk and looked at our name above the door. I said, "Show me the tap system." He laughed. First real laugh I'd heard from him in months. He said, "It's incredible, Dad. I told you." I said, "You did." He held the door open and I walked in. The brewery smelled like grain and wood and something new. The kind of new that has been earned. I looked around the room. The long bar, the high ceilings, the light coming through the windows. And I thought about 14 months of patience, about a forensic accountant who finds fraud genuinely entertaining, about a lawyer who speaks slowly on purpose, about a woman who noticed a half-second smile at a dinner table and trusted her instincts enough to say something. And I thought about the fact that I almost signed that check on a Sunday afternoon without a second thought, because it had my family's name on the logo and my son's hope in his eyes, and sometimes love makes you want to skip the part where you pay attention. Almost. I sat down at the bar. Preston poured 2 glasses and set one in front of me. He raised him. He said to the brewery. I picked up my glass. I looked at my son. I looked at the room. I said to pay attention. We drank. And outside through the window, the October light did what October light always does. It made everything look like it had already survived something. Because it had. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.